So thanks everyone for coming out. This is actually a much bigger crowd than we were expecting. Everyone showed up last second here. But so I think the way that we're going to do this is Samantha and I are going to each individually talk just a little bit about our practices and how we think through our work. And then we'll maybe more informally kind of discuss the connections that we see between the work, or really the conversation that's unfolded in this exhibition. So you find with that? So I taught an 8 a.m. drawing class this morning in St. Louis, so bear with me if I ramble or lose my thought here, but yeah, let's do this. So I guess the starting point to talk about my practice, where it is right now as a painter, is to say that at least where the work stands currently, I consider myself as much a storyteller as I am a painter. So a lot of this work, or at least the way of understanding this work for me, is to address the mythology that I'm building that unfolds between canvases. So there's a set of recurring characters that I refer to as border creatures that populate these paintings. And much of what I do is thinking about the way that they inhabit the world that they live in, how their actions unfold, and what this story, this mythology might mean. So because I consider this to be a myth, I guess to clarify what I mean there is that really it's a way for me to make sense of certain issues in the world around us today. And in that sense, I think it's important to address the ideological structure that upholds the stories that I tell and informs them. So this might get a little abstract for a second, but bear with me and I'll bring it back down into the work in a second. But this is just the messy, just abstract idea stuff that I throw around in my studio when I'm jotting down notes. So probably the starting point, central pillar for the conceptual framework of my paintings would be the idea of nature, or more specifically, I would say the idea of the natural. And when I say the natural, you're probably thinking the environment or environmentalism, and you're certainly correct, and that's something I do think about my work. But I always try to also connect it to the issue of identity and the body. And the connection there, the bridge between these two categories that keeps them inextricably linked in my mind, is the fallacy of a belief in a natural body or in natural law. Now, when I say natural law as it refers to the body, I'm not talking about like the biological systems of the body. That's not at all in question. What I mean by natural law is this idea that there's a correct way to inhabit a body, that there's a correct way to be a human being. This is the fiction that's told by the religious right to marginalize certain groups of populations, certain transgressive identities or sexual identities. And it's something that I always try to think of my work as a fervent refutation. It's an offering an alternative narrative. The narrative that I build counters this, and I would say it hijacks the language of the natural body to tell a story about a cast of characters that are wildly celebratory of their transgressive nature. So when you look at these creatures, they're not distinct in their form. You don't see an orderly, structured, defined body. You see hybrid bodies, bodies that exist in space in a way that brings elements of their environment into them. They're hybrid. They have plants as part of their anatomy. They have some animal traits within them. They're part human. They even, in some instances, I would say, there's only one in this show that has this, but even at certain points they start to crystallize and take on inanimate crystalline structures in their form, right? So maybe the last point I'd like to make about this, and again, this is all kind of abstract, and I'll address some of the more particular elements of my work when we get to Q&A, maybe in a less like formal setting like this, but the last thing to sort of ground this in why I think this is important, why this maybe personally matters to me, is to mention something, I guess, about my bio that sort of in recent years I've come to understand shapes a lot of the decisions I make about how I build this story. So I grew up in the Deep South in Georgia in a closeted queer family. And I had a transgender parent that I lived with, and we lived as a complete family unit. My parents were together, but we lived closeted, and I had to tell stories to people, make these heteronormative fictions about my family, and explain that the person that was actually my biological father was maybe my aunt, or, you know, it got really elaborate the more questions people asked. But this fiction that I had to tell sat poorly with me for a long time. And when I started making this work, I maybe didn't understand how important the storytelling aspect was to the work that I was making. But it's gotten increasingly narrative over time, and I'd say, really at this point, telling these celebratory, joyous stories about transgressive bodies, about monsters, about creatures that are seen as alien and other, that seems liberating to me at this point. It's really something that I've come to really enjoy in the work that I make. Yeah, I don't want to go on too much further than that, but I'll give Samantha a chance to talk, and then we'll talk about the work that works together. So yeah, great.
Well, that's a tough act to follow. Hi, everybody. I'm Samantha. Thank you so much for coming. I, on the other hand, make very quiet paintings in a noisy world. I am an observational painter, and in the last couple of years, I've been using my studio as subject matter to talk about ideas of absence and presence and the inherent duality of those things. There's a tremendous amount of energy in an artist's studio space, and the history is literally written on the walls and the floor in paint splatters and dust and the residue left behind by previous inhabitants. And that is fascinating to me, that history. I mentioned that I'm an observational painter because these interiors in this gallery look very abstract. But it's important to know that even though they function like abstract landscapes, they are actually very carefully observed. Every place you see in my work actually exists. It's grounded in reality. Every mark, every drip, every splatter was very carefully observed and then equally carefully documented for that particular moment in time. I'm very interested in the idea of absence and presence and things that are both there and not there. I find that the ephemera, the marks left in a studio space, are a great metaphor for the imprint that we leave behind on each other and on the world. I spent the past year as an artist in residence at Manifest Gallery, and that was an amazing experience. I was given a studio space with amazing north light, and having that entire year to dedicate to a studio practice was incredibly inspiring. And not only did I have time to experiment and create a new body of work and research to further develop my concepts, I also had a chance to try out a bunch of ideas that had been floating around in my brain for a long time. And this series was one of them. For the longest time, I wanted to document an entire space, to recreate a complete studio through drawings. So these 11 pastels are part of a larger series of work that I made this past year. I sat on the floor in between making other paintings. I sat on the floor, I propped up my drawing board, and I started drawing the baseboard. And I followed the path of the baseboard all the way around the room. And I actually drew the entire perimeter of the room. Doors, corners, and all. And what I found as I moved across the room was that the parts of the floor and the wall that I found to be least interesting, that were maybe the most blank or the least dynamic with really bright colors or splotches of paint, the most quote-unquote boring sections were actually my favorites. Those ended up being my favorite pieces. So you can see some of these pieces on this wall here are very clean and crisp. You can very clearly see the line between the wall and the floor. And then as you move around the gallery to these pieces, these are the last pieces in the series. that accumulation is very important to me. It's part of the narrative in these pieces. Adrian talks about being a storyteller. I feel the same way. Even though my pieces are devoid of figures, they still have that figurative presence, right? The human presence is implied by the remnants of the mind. We affect the world around us and the places that we inhabit, whether consciously or not. And sometimes dust is the only reminder we have of what was. The other thing I want to mention before we get to the Q&A is that these pieces all share a horizon line. They share a space where the wall meets the floor. That line is consistent from piece to piece. So when they're seen side by side, they give the illusion of an unending vista or a complete space that stretches out in either direction, ever incomplete. I deliberately left out the corners in this series because I found that really what I was most interested in was that between space, that liminal space between the wall and the floor, that imperfect boundary where they meet. That horizon line became fascinating to me. And the more I worked on this series, the more I started thinking about liminality and betweenness, and how betweenness is our reality on a daily basis. You know, we are always in between, whether it's between jobs, between drawings, between genders, between breaths. Betweenness is the majority of our days, and yet so often it's relegated to just between to argue more interesting events. But I think that there's great beauty and great profoundness to be found in those quiet between moments. I think that there's a lot of noise in silence, and that's what I've been thinking about lately.
So I guess at this point we can just kind of talk a little bit about some of how this came together and maybe some of what we've talked about between the two bodies. So probably one thing some of you might be wondering is how we know each other, how we had this come about. So I'm from St. Louis. I run a small alternative art space down in St. Louis, and I just happened to find Samantha's work online and invited her to exhibit. This was when she was still in Chicago. And she encountered my work down in St. Louis, and we just kind of stayed in touch. So that's how that connection formed. Yeah, but once we started talking, I think the reason this show makes sense is maybe on a surface level, when you're looking at this, you think maybe it's a point of contrast, that, you know, horror, VACUI, that one is empty, one is full, that my work kind of shouts a lot, and maybe yours is more of a whisper, a subtle whisper. But I would say that the common ground is the more interesting thing. The common ground has more to do with maybe an aesthetic impulse or like a mode of operation in the studio. I don't know, do you want to expand on that?
You do very good. Yeah, I agree with that completely. I think the contrast is fairly obvious. But the similarity is interesting. You know, when you share that interest in the unusual, or perhaps the overlooked or the neglected in some way, and finding beauty in things that may otherwise go unnoticed or unremarked.
Yeah. Well, and I think the word beauty is key. We've talked about this. I wrote an essay recently on beauty in contemporary art, and
it's an excellent essay.
Thank you. It's I think the fact that we're both contemporary artists who are not afraid to say the word beauty in a non-ironic way is maybe the lays out the groundwork for why we get along when we talk about art. Yeah, I think there's a sincerity to our work, and I think that idea of beautification and attention to either the neglected or the things that would be dejected or rejected, and a way of transforming them using beauty. I think that's kind of a key connection there.
I think sincerity is really important for that. You know, being completely honest about beauty in these things. It's not sarcastic in any way. It's not a joke. It's not, oh, haha, look at this.
Well, I would say jokes are definitely okay too. I don't think sincerity and humorlessness are not the same. So I think my work is funny. Sometimes. I mean, sometimes it's not, but a lot of times I think my work is funny. But
these are funny things. Butterfly pictures is hysterical.
Right. but I don't want them to feel as if they're mocking the subject. I don't want them to feel insincere as, right? I suppose it's all right for there to be a joke within the work, but I don't want it to be at the expense of the subject that's being depicted, if that makes sense. I feel a connection to the subjects I paint. I try to always create some sense of empathy in what I do, and use that to frame. So I guess in my own guiding principles in the studio practice, there's a sense of sincerity, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It takes sincerity to make these paintings and to make them as honest as they are. And there's also that attention to detail that I think we share.
In your work especially, I mean, the fact that these from a distance maybe seem empty, that we talked about Mark Rothko, that like immediately you look at them and you think, Mark Rothko, empty, like kind of painting the void. But then you get up close and these things are just as full as my paintings, just using a different kind of language and a different language of subtlety, and I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, that's a big part of what I'm thinking about. The idea that emptiness is not really empty, that blank space is anything but. Actually, the way we both approach the board is an interesting thing, right? You fill out the canvas, and every square inch is so lovingly rendered and full of gorgeous detail. You can get lost in a square inch, right?
I feel like neither of us are modernists in any sense of the word. We were both Baroque to our core. Just fill the void with just luscious beauty. Just fill it.
Yeah, that's true in all of my art history professors.
Yeah. I mean, I even have a fondness for Rococo painting, and that's like one of those, like, everyone wants to bash on 18th century French painting, and, I'm nerding out art history-wise right now, but I have a personal fondness for the decadent and the ornamental. Yeah, I mean, I think like those get overlooked or neglected maybe too often. We're maybe like getting away. Do you want to just like ask some or field some questions?
Oh, sure. Do you guys have any questions?
Yeah.
Sure.
I have a question for you, Samantha. You said you did 11 in the series. Is it all based on the work you did on this current series that you're doing now?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for that. These 11 pastels are actually part of a series of 25. These are 25 drawings to make it all the way around the room. And they are all the same composition, actually. There's the same amount of baseboard, there's the same amount of floor, and really the only thing that changes is the amount of residue.
Did you end up throwing anything away?
Yes. I should say there are 25 that are showable. There were probably 40 that I made, but they can't be good. But yeah, it's that idea of emptiness came up a lot, and filling that space and paying attention. I think that's what it comes down to. Just having paying attention.
Yeah.
The
Perception.
matters. Yeah. The color of the wall or the turn of the leaf, right? It's all really.
Yeah. I mean, my work has gotten like really since we first met. I've gone down the rabbit hole of like getting increasingly attentive to every single square inch of what I do. So, anyone have any other questions?
I think I understand how you edit. How do you edit?
Oh, I don't. So
I'm so jealous.
I very seldomly make paintings that don't go somewhere and exhibit, or if they do, it's not because I don't like them. And that is because I am an obsessive planner. I don't ever start a painting until I know it's going to work. And this is like complete blasphemy from like the painter's position, work through it, like, just power through it, like make the monk happen. But, I'm glazing. Like, there can be some room for error within that. I mean, a colleague and friend of mine, Jeannie Adams, just goes through practically like 15 stages of its underpainting before it reaches its composition. But I'm not that kind of painter. I have to know right away if things are going to work. So I sculpt these things. I have my studio completely packed with sculptures. I'm running out of room, but that's okay because I use these sculptures time and again. So you know, I'm making this painting in the far back of Waking Big Dreamer, that squishy pink painting back there. That figure is in 2 of the paintings I'm working on right now. So these characters pop up again and again and again because I have them physically made and waiting to be painted. And because I have them physically made, I can do a lot with drawing directly from them in my sketchbook, photographing. I use Photoshop probably more than I should. And that all happens, colored lights, that all happens like well before I even start thinking about actually making the painting. So, yeah.
That's another interesting similarity. We're both observational painters, although that might not be readily obvious.
Well, I mean, I'm like, I wouldn't call myself observational because like there's so much mediation between like making the object and then painting it. Like I put it through like just trials of processing. Like it gets colored lights and then it gets photographed and then I like pull out a tablet and like draw on the computer like next to it. It goes through a lot of processes, but it starts with an object in full. So I guess it relates back to observation and perception of actual things. I guess like one of the reasons I do that is I don't want these to feel like they're surrealist fantasies. I want them to feel more real than that. So I feel like there's a necessity of making something. This is probably more of a connection rather than observation is the idea of presence. We talk about presence and absence. Like this idea of being in a space in front of something, that a representation can be more than a representation. There is a phenomenon of observing a work of art where if it is successful enough that it feels physically present in front of you. It's not a fantasy, it's not an illusion, it's something there that you are just physically in front of. And that's, I don't hit it every time. I mean, pretty much no painter hits it every time, but that's for me at least like the holy grail that I try and hit every single time I paint.
Absolutely, too. There's the painting as window, right? Where you're creating worlds. When you make a work of art, you're creating something that didn't exist before, and you're transporting the viewer. If you've done it well, you're transporting the viewer into this world that you